Hello, my name is Ghenwa Hakim, and you are watching The Arabic Hour. On today's program, we welcome back our longtime friend, Dr. Alice Rothchild. Dr. Rothchild is a physician, activist, and author, and is here today to discuss her recent documentary film entitled Voices Across the Divide. Dr. Rothchild began her activism work in the 1960s and 70s, revolving around the topics of feminism and health reform movement. She later became involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through her work with the Boston Workmen Circle in 1997. Among her many accomplishments, she is the coordinating committee of Jewish Voice for Peace Boston, co-founding and co-chairing American Jews for a Just Peace Boston, and co-organizing the AJJP Health and Human Rights Project. Many of our viewers may recognize Dr. Rothchild from her last appearance on the Arabic Hour, in which she discussed her book, Broken Promises, Broken Dreams, Stories of Jewish and Palestinian Trauma and Resilience. We are delighted to welcome back Dr. Rothchild to our program to discuss her recent documentary, which more information can be found about on her website, www.voicesacrossthedivide.com. Alice, welcome back to the Arabic Hour. It's great to have you here always.
Good to be here.
So about a year ago, actually, you were here, and we were talking about the making of your documentary film, Voices Across the Divide. And since then, you know, it's had great success. It was premiered first at the Boston Palestine Film Festival in 2013. Before we get into all the exciting details, I'd like to share the trailer that you brought with you for the film so that our audience can see a little bit of that. Roll tape.
How do you understand history? Who controls the message? Is the media muzzled, lazy, confused, manipulated? How do you create personal and political change? I invite you to join me in exploring one of the most pressing and complex issues of our day.
In 1948, there was a lot of fighting around our house.
My eldest sister was shot.
A bullet come over our heads.
In 1967, I would call it the transformation from childhood to hell.
After the 67 war, if you weren't physically in the place where you were, you had no right to live in that place.
They're Palestinians, refugees.
This can't go on for much longer. People's eyes are beginning to open to what Israel's doing.
My name is Alice Rothchild, and I was born in 1948 in Boston. I'm an American Jew, interestingly enough, born the same year that the State of Israel was founded. My parents were first-generation Americans who instilled in us a sense that Jews were a distinct and often endangered tribe. This Jewishness soon became grounded in our love for Israel. But as I grew up, I realized I had never actually met an Arab before, and I only knew one side of this complex historical narrative. Starting in the 1990s, I began an active search for the voices that I had never heard, meeting and listening to dissenting Israelis, Palestinians, other Arabs in the United States. And then in 2003, I started co-organizing delegations to Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, and meeting with Israelis and Palestinians in the region. I began to hear the enormous human commonalities between Arabs and Jews. And I also had to confront the trauma and the fear that pulses in my own Jewish DNA. Based on these experiences, I wrote a book, and then I began collecting stories of Palestinians who had come to the United States. I knew that May 14, 1948 was the glorious day that the State of Israel was founded. This was a victory over anti-Semitism and the Nazi Holocaust. For Palestinians, that day is called Al-Nakba, the catastrophe. The interviews with Palestinians that I will share with you in this film are the invisible voices that we have never heard. They are the other part of our story.
I come from a village called Al-Qubab. It's one of those villages, the 400 and some that in 1948 were totally demolished. I lived through the exodus from the village in late April, early May 1948.
It happened when I'm younger. I remember it exactly. When in 1948, my father came home and he told my mother that there is a neighbor across the street from us was killed. And he said, by the evening, by 6 o'clock, we have to go. So he get the whole family in the taxi. I remember running. I said, just can I take my doll? I love to take this little doll with me. And he said, just run and get it. And my mom, she has a baby, 15 days old. So she grabbed her jewelry, wrap it in the receiving blanket of the baby, and she throws all in the car, and we left.
For centuries in Eastern Europe, Jews were victimized by anti-Semitism and pogroms, and this all culminated in the Nazi Holocaust. So for Jews, being victimized by an outside Christian culture, it's part of our core identity. We all feel like we all experienced the Holocaust and we all survived the Holocaust. For Palestinians, the Nakba is also a huge catastrophe. But for Palestinians, there has never been an opportunity to have closure on this trauma.
So I do want to go back to that first screening, that's, the highlight probably. What was the audience's reaction to the documentary, and was it a mixed audience? Did they give you feedback about it? Love to hear.
So it premiered on a Monday afternoon, and I was sure that no one would come. And it was at the Cambridge Public Library. It's a gorgeous hall, over 200 seats, and we filled the hall, which was wonderful. And it was very, very well received. I got a standing ovation, actually co-won the Audience Award with A World Not Ours. And I had a lot of really intense positive feedback, and it was a mixed audience, sort of reflecting Boston more.
Okay, great. And what type of feedback did the audience give you about, some audience members I'm sure are a little bit more familiar with the Holocaust than with the Palestinian cause, the Nakba, and some, vice versa. And the documentary really is about your experience through your own journey through discovering the stories of these Palestinians for yourself, based on the stories you said in the documentary. Your mother was a storyteller, and that's kind of how this led you to this exploration of that. Did you get a sense that they learned something, that they were going through their own experience while watching the documentary?
Well, it sort of depended on which audience member. So if it was a Palestinian, they were on the whole very excited to see their story being told in a way that's accessible to American audiences. If it was a student who's just learning about the conflict, it was sort of more educational, history, that kind of thing. If it was someone who's working in peace and reconciliation and dialogue and that kind of stuff, people were very supportive of the idea that I was, again, furthering the conversation, exploring my journey, trying to make it something that people could be more familiar with. And so it really depended on where the person was coming from, how they responded to the movie. But people tend to respond from their own place and to have a powerful response. No one is quiet after they watch the movie.
That's good. So, the documentary is based off of people's personal stories, stories of their family's experience. How powerful is a personal narrative as opposed to, a piece of journalism or something in experiencing and sharing the struggles and, the Nakba, the occurrences of 48, 67, which you cover, a lot of years within the documentary. What's the power of a personal story?
Well, I think the personal stories are actually extremely powerful. I mean, if you learn facts, figures, this leader did that, this war happened, it doesn't really hit you in an emotional kind of way. But to hear a particular person who had a particular expulsion from a particular village and went to a particular place, it makes it really much more real. So what I tried to do was focus on the two major dispossessions, the 48 and the 67, and focus on the consequences of those dispossessions. So someone who's born in Kuwait because his family couldn't come back or fled or whatever happened. So I think personal stories really make history much more accessible to people. And also people approach this conflict with a lot of stereotypes. And one of the things that is very powerful for me is that, you know, Jewish people have been oppressed, they've been expelled, they've been traumatized, you know, they have this whole history, and then there is a very similar language that Palestinians use. So I try to get people in a very human, personal way, and I think that it does reach across stereotypes and prejudices and feelings about what they're like and what I'm like. You know, you find out that, you know, expulsion is expulsion.
Mm-hmm. So I actually, you know, was very fortunate to be able to have my own private screening of the documentary, and so I got to pick up on a lot of, you know, these one-liners that really stood out to me in the documentary. And one of the person's stories that you recalled was that during the Nakba, they not only, you know, were dispossessed of their homes, their land, you know, families had to separate, and you know, things like that, but you said that they lost their future reference points.
Right.
Right.
One of the interviewees said
exactly.
that. Yeah.
So they felt like, you know, they didn't have a reference point for the future anymore. They didn't know what was next, where they were going to be next. And I think, you know, that is kind of a common thread for all of these stories. Mm-hmm. Did you find that that was common as well?
Yes. I mean, when someone becomes a refugee very suddenly, everything is disrupted. All the familiarities of their life are disrupted. But also, you know, you're on a trajectory, and suddenly your trajectory totally changes. Your economics totally changes. You're psychologically traumatized. I mean, it really shakes the whole future up. And so the thing I found interesting, because I also come from a family that were poor immigrants who came to the States and worked in sweatshops and gradually made their way through America, is to see how Palestinians who were dispossessed, who were refugees, then ended up here, and what their immigrant experience was, and how they had to create a whole new life and a whole new language and future. So the parallels really interested me, and also I think it's sort of a testament to the resiliency of people that they can do that.
Another thing that many of the people mentioned was that, you know, their families in 48 thought that they were leaving for 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. And then they would all be back. So they left a lot of things, you know, as they were kind of like preserved within their homes, so that when they returned, they would, you know, be able to resume that life that, you know, was kind of torn up. Was that another common thread throughout all of the stories? Did that, you know, affect how they were able to move on, whether they've been able to kind of ever be able to build an actual constructive future, always having that in the back of their mind that they would be returning home?
Well, the 48 stories all came, or most of them came from an event in Detroit where I had a public event that was co-organized with Jewish Voice for Peace and a Palestinian group in Detroit. And so people had 20 minutes to tell their Nakba story, and they were telling it to me in a public forum in front of an audience. And one of the things, when I went back and reviewed all the different tapes, is that everyone said, we left for 2 weeks, we left for 15 days. I mean, everybody had that same time frame. So, and then I went back and researched, you know, primary material and newspaper reports mm-hmm. and that kind of stuff. And since I grew up with the Palestinians were told to leave, or they left of their own volition, or that kind of story, the consistency in the 2-week story was really, really striking. And the fact that people, you know, left things ready to come back in their homes and just, you know, often didn't even pack a suitcase because they really thought they were coming back, you know, then validates the fact that everybody said they thought they were coming back. So I think that that's a very, very common thread in the story, and is also one of the reasons why it was so traumatic, because people, you know, they didn't take all their money, they didn't take their clothes, they didn't take what anyone who is leaving forever would take. Right. So that's part of the trauma of the 48 Nakba.
In the documentary, you reference also to the 67 war, and how, you know, there was a few years in between 48 and 67 where life kind of resumed. You know, people had to move either to the West Bank. They were internally displaced. For the people that were, you know, in Ramallah, that had originated from elsewhere, their lives were a little bit moving on. But then 67 happened, and that was kind of another shock, another blow to them. We actually have a clip of 2 women recalling the stories of that time, and I'd like to share that with the audience first. Roll tape.
So let's place you. 67, you're in Ramallah.
I'm in Ramallah.
You're how old?
10 years old.
You're going to Catholic school.
Catholic school. Life is wonderful. There's nothing wrong, and all of a sudden I would call it the transformation from childhood to hell. Our house became a shelter because we have a basement. So we have 30 neighbors sitting in a small place, listening to a small transistor radio, no electricity whatsoever. Everybody gathered their food, but the grown-up basically knew that we need to ration. And after 3 or 4 days, the ration became, less and less. But, I'm 10 years old. Nothing bothered me in here except you're sitting there and you look at the fear. After the 6th day, you hear soldiers in Arabic saying, war is over, you could come out and you could have a white flag. You go out there and it was Israeli armies and soldiers that spoke Arabic. You see the panic on the family and you know it was not an Arab army.
June 5th was the beginning of the war, and that was a Monday. Wednesday was the day that Nablus was taken. It was very scary because they would come at night in the tanks and in the jeeps and all of that, and sirens. It'll be like 2 in the morning, they will get the sirens going until about 5 in the morning, just around town, and then bullets. We had no shelters, there's nothing. And we had to find a place in the house that was the safest. So we sat all in one corridor. And then we had to have the lecture from my father about what will happen if we separate, because there was this fear about taking prisoners, raping women. But all of that dimmed compared to the idea of we are going to be kicked out. So go put whatever you need to take with you together because we're going to be kicked out. And I think that's the fear of the Palestinians. So I remember my father coming to us and basically handing us the little money that we had and some jewelry, and we all agreed that if we separated and if we're kicked out, where we're going to meet.
Israel was putting what they call lessons in the neighborhood. One time at 4 o'clock in the morning, soldiers came in and took 2 of my cousins at age 14 and 13, and they were dragged out of their house, and for 3 days they were never seen. They said they were beaten, they were harassed, they were asked the same question over and over and over again. No charges whatsoever, and then come back. Then there is curfews. Your house is totally sealed. You can't go in, you can't go out. You are literally a prisoner in your own home. During a curfew in 1969, that's when they came in and broke into our house and beat my dad up in front of us. They started beating him with the butt of their guns and dragging him out. As they were dragging him out, we lived across from convent, Catholic convent. Sister Pia looked out of the window and checked, and she said, well, why are you doing this to him? What harm did he do to you? And they shot at him. And they kept beating him up till a sergeant came in from where, and till today we say, bless that guy. And he told them to stop. What they were doing that day, they went from one house to another. And every male in that neighborhood, they beat. My mom and dad asked that we pray for these soldiers. They said, these are young kids, they don't know what they're doing, they're afraid. So why don't you pray for them?
It's, extremely powerful to hear those stories. It's moving. And it also reminds us that, these instances that they're describing, the woman who was describing her father being dragged from their home and beaten, sadly that, these stories are happening now in our present day. The brutal and arbitrary reminders that are executed through violence against Palestinians occur daily. And firsthand, you go and you witness these things. Have things changed from 67? Are they going to change?
That's a very big question. So, obviously things change because things do change. one of the themes of my film is that the Nakba isn't over, so that it's taken various forms. Dispossession takes various forms. You know, in '67 there wasn't all the checkpoints and the bypass roads and the enormous settlement project and all the things that are the facts of life of occupation now. But the fact that there is an occupying power and there's a population that's a civilian population that is controlled by the occupying power is still ongoing. You know, and the circumstances change, and there's the Palestinian Authority, and there's all the cooperation with the U.S., and I mean, it's much more complicated now, I think, but the themes are the same. And the themes relate to sort of a Jewish entitlement over this land and a desire to control the population and to hem it in and to make life pretty miserable for people. Personally, I think in the hopes that they will leave. So that the whole active versus passive transfer, I think, is different now. But again, the themes are pretty much the same.
So the other woman spoke a little bit about how, you know, they were going to school and enjoying their lives, and then '67 happened. But that was, you know, their experiences. Did, you know, Palestinians in the camps have a similar experience from '48 to '67, or were their lives different?
Well, Palestinians that are in refugee camps have a very different experience. You know, the refugee camps were set up by the UN as a temporary thing with tents, and then over the years it became clear that the tents weren't going anywhere, so people started, you know, getting materials to build small houses. And we're talking about, you know, a family of 6 gets 1 room and a family of 10 gets 2 rooms. It's that kind of housing. And they're still here. So if you visit various camps, as I have done, they tend to be small, extremely crowded. There's no green space. People tend to build vertically because they can't go laterally. So the houses all kind of lean into each other. There tend to be kind of winding alleys and tons of kids playing on the concrete. So that experience is very, very different. And people in the camps have their education provided by the UN, their healthcare provided by the UN. Tends to be underfunded, overcrowded. The possibilities for a future are much more narrow. There's a tremendous resiliency in the camps. There are children's theaters and photography groups and writing groups and all sorts of political factions, and, you know, it depends on the camp exactly what's going on. But that's a very different life than someone who escaped to Jordan and then ended up in, you know, Dearborn. I mean, it's just a totally different life.
That's why your film is so interesting, because it incorporates so many different voices and so many different people's experiences. And at one point in the documentary, you asked a really important question as to where was home for the different Palestinians in the film. Can you share with us the experience of hearing those responses?
Well, I was very interested in knowing what people felt where home was located, because I distinguish home from, you know, political issues of right of return or all those kind of issues. I wanted to know personally where they felt home was. And there was a huge variety. There were people who felt home is wherever my children are. So if my children live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, then that's home. There are people who feel like no matter what, Jerusalem is my home, or, you know, my village in the West Bank is my home. So there's the whole spectrum of human response. It was a very, you know, to hear all the different responses was very poignant. And I should say, you know, my film is only 55 minutes long, but I have something like 22 hours of interviews. So I have posted all of the full interviews on my website. So people who are interested in really getting to know the different characters in the movie can hear the whole interviews, and there's also transcripts. So it's really available for education and for improving people's understanding of the region.
So the last, and I'll paraphrase here, but the last line was, let us not be afraid.
Yeah.
You said that.
Right.
What did you mean by that?
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons why people in the United States can't see Palestinians as fellow human beings. And, you know, also as a Jewish person, you know, I grew up with the Arabs were the terrorists, you know, they were the enemy. So I think there are many things that create blinders for us. One is fear, one is generational trauma, the Holocaust, all that sort of baggage that we are both born with and given as people. And then there is racism and Islamophobia and all the sort of layering that goes on in a particular culture. So I'm really encouraging people to be very conscious of what the blinders are and try to take them off and really see human beings as fellow human beings, equally deserving, with a history, with rights, with traumas, with reasons to be angry, with mistakes. I mean, just like me, you know. So that's one of the themes of the movie.
So Alice, as we touched upon a bit, your personal experience through making this documentary began with storytelling, and you experiencing these stories for yourself, and then wanting to, you know, bring them more together. The last time you were here, we discussed a little bit about the experience of collecting these different stories, and about the reactions of you telling a Palestinian story, how the Palestinians' perception of you know, this outsider, pardon the expression, but to tell their story. Does that leave you with a level of responsibility that you feel for these stories? Can you speak a little bit about that experience?
Well, I was very honored that people were willing to entrust their stories to me, and I also felt a huge responsibility to get it right. So as I was making the film, I did focus groups, and I did focus groups with Palestinians. I did focus groups, I showed the film to people who were in the film. I kept checking back, am I getting this right? Am I getting this right? Because it's a bit presumptuous of me to go off and tell the story of somebody else. But I also felt like our stories are interwoven, and that because I live in a world where people don't know these stories, it's my responsibility to share them. But it's a very delicate process. And there were actually some people who were angry with me that I was doing this. It wasn't my place.
Who were the people that were angry with
Palestinian
Okay.
Americans. And so we talked, you know, because I feel like I completely get it, that it's not my place. But on the other hand, I have a task, because I've been given these stories, and I think they're too powerful and important to just keep to myself. So I feel like I do have a responsibility to share them, and to share them in a very sensitive, humble way. The other thing is that I feel like part of my job is to embrace the Nakba story as part of my history, because it is interwoven with my history, and that's part of moving forward in a conversation, is to really recognize the other person and their story. And so I'm trying to model that behavior and say, see, I did it, walk with me on this one, and you do it too.
Have you seen a response from the Jewish community about, you know, hearing maybe these Palestinian stories for the first time, and whether they're incorporating, as you said, the Nakba with the Holocaust as a shared experience?
Well, there's not a monolithic Jewish community, as I've said before. So I think if you look at sort of the spectrum within the Jewish community, there are certainly Jewish activists who are really happy with this film because it does bridge barriers and, you know, invite people into the conversation. I think that this is a tough sell in the Jewish community, the more mainstream Jewish community. You know, I was someone at the Newton Public Library asked if they could show the film, and then they saw it and they said it's too controversial to show in Newton, and I was like, this is just the place that it needs to be shown, you know. So it's interesting. There's a whole spectrum that's a reflection of the range in the Jewish community. But, you know, I'm showing it at Brandeis. I'm showing it at a temple in Ithaca. You know, I'm working my way in, because I think that's my job.
So also, you know, just the fact of, as you said, bearing witness to these stories, to these people's experiences, I think in itself is a form of activism, because you're, you know, sharing the people's experiences with a greater community. Do you feel like there has been an activist response towards the documentary?
Well, this is absolutely a form of activism. I didn't make a film about people in Hawaii. You know, I made a film about something that I'm very passionate about, and I was very excited. I was invited to the John Jay College of Criminal Justice for Israel Apartheid Week, and the Students for Justice in Palestine showed my film and had me do a Q&A, and I felt very honored to be asked. And now an SJP in Atlanta wants to show my film. So, you know, it is an activist film, and I want it to be that way. And that's why I'm touring with it, doing Q&As, trying to arrange panels with Palestinians, talking back afterwards. You know, I want it to not just be a documentary film about something.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the people that are in the film, how you know them, what their roles are, a little bit about their personal journeys?
Sure. So I interviewed people in Detroit, Ann Arbor, and Boston. And basically, someone had a friend who had a friend who had a friend. I didn't screen people. I didn't ask for particular types of people. So it was really sort of by connection. And one of the things that really interested me is not only the people's stories, but what they are doing with their lives in terms of activism around Palestine. So for the older people, a lot of their activism was around telling their story, having photo exhibits, just trying to clarify history. And for the younger people in the film, one of them takes children, teenagers over to Palestine to work on projects. It's called Project Hope. One of them speaks in universities, learn to do the dabka dancing and expose culture. One of them works on the boycott, divestment, sanction movement. I mean, everybody had different ways that they translated their experience into activism, and I found that very inspirational.
In terms of the activism role of the people that are in the film itself, did you find that this kind of grew with them as they learn more about their own personal stories, or whether they grew up around activists and then decided to carry on?
These people weren't necessarily in activist families. They were regular people living lives who suddenly were disrupted by war, by dispossession, by political events way beyond their control. And so their activism grew out of their personal experiences and their need to find a place, and also to have some positive optimism about the future, because when you lose everything, it's very, very traumatic. So they didn't come from, one of them came from a sort of political family in Nablus, but it wasn't activism around the conflict, it was sort of left-wing activism. So each person went on their own journey, but everybody found some way to use their past to inform their future work, and that was really amazing to see.
So also on the website, it's extremely developed. There's a lot of information, as you mentioned earlier. The full interview tapes are on the website. What else is available?
Well, the website has a number of things. One, it has a study guide, so that if this is used in a university setting, there are sort of questions to think about. I have a whole resource list of organizations and books, so because I want people to get excited and want to learn more, because 55-minute film can't tell you the whole thing. And I also went back and looked at historical timelines and tried to develop a historical timeline that included Palestinian history, because that's usually left out, because history is told by the victors and not by the victims usually. And then I put in everybody in the movie where they were born in the context of this timeline, so that people can see where their lives fit in what was going on. So I want people to use the website as an important resource and to really learn about the conflict through the website, but in a very personal kind of way.
And also, if people wanted to contact you, to invite you, would they be able to contact you through the website?
Right. The email address is in the website, and also people can buy the DVDs on the website. So it's available. I have a PayPal account. It's very easy to do.
Thank you so much for your hard work in putting together these stories and putting together this documentary. And thank you for joining us today at the Arabic Hour.
Thank you.
For more information on the documentary film Voices Across the Divide, visit the website at www.voicesacrossthedivide.com. We'll be back with more after this break.
You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.